this morning. We had Peter Menon from Pretoria. Welcome, Peter.
Good morning, Michelle.
How's Pretoria today?
Fantastic, beautiful weather. Unfortunately, we had a little bit of a power issue this morning as well, so it's been a bit of a runaround for the TPN team, but I'm so glad we're on live. Great.
Fantastic. So, folks, today we're going to be talking about destruction and retention of your data and the policies and some practical inputs from that perspective as well. Just some setup for today's session. If the screen does seem blurry to you, on the video, down at the bottom, there's a little cog on the right-hand side of the video. Click on the cog, click on quality, and change your quality setting to a minimum of 720p, not auto, 720p, and that will resolve any blurry screen that you might have. Please do log into your YouTube channel. Once you logged into the YouTube channel, you can then ask your questions on the chat, and I'll be facilitating. Peter's going to take us through the training as usual, and then I'm going to facilitate those questions and answers as they may come up. And Peter, you can answer those for us.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Wonderful. Yes, I'm so excited about this session. We actually did a very similar session for the property industry when it came to this specific module, and we did get a great uptake because I think it's something very practical. We're talking about today is the retention and destruction. So we're talking about how long records can be kept in your business, but also how to destroy those records when they reach their retention periods or the latency periods that you can keep those records for.
100%. You know, Peter, there's a couple things that come up for me. The first is I know many schools, especially in our nursery schools, our preschools, use scrap paper. And then leads me to a story that one of our staff members had when they still worked at the bank. And this particular story, the scrap paper that was left lying around was actually had some personal information on it. And through the investigation, it was discovered because you can see the journey of documents right from when they are printed, who printed them, what user to what printer. Right through the journey of this, it was discovered that this information was supposed to have been shredded, and it wasn't. It was found lying around. And in TPN's environment, part of the shredding process is you have to have a clean desk policy. Nothing gets destroyed through the bins, it gets destroyed through the shredder. And not only is it about taking the document through the shredding process, but it's making sure that the document is in actual fact shredded. Because at that handover, that point, that chain of the handover of the document from the business to the shredding company, part of the process is to ensure that it actually goes through the shredding machine and it is in actual fact destroyed.
Of course, Michelle, it might be great for the environment using spare pieces of paper for perhaps children to draw on or even perhaps to print on, but not necessarily the best idea when it comes to POPI compliance. But you've hit the nail right on the head. When it comes to this, it's not just about the policy and procedure, it's about the practical implementation of that policy and procedure, how you actually go and destroy the documentation, whether that be by shredding, and even discussing just today also about electronic records and how to destroy electronic records. We've actually got 2 video inserts for everybody today having a look that is done by our IT team, and they're going to explain to everybody exactly how to destroy both paper records as well as electronic forms of data.
We actually had quite a bit of fun setting those 2 videos up for our viewers today. But enough about the introduction. Peter, I'm going to hand over to you and you're going to take us through this journey.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Wonderful. We are up. Good. Okay, folks, so let's jump straight into this. For today's session, like we mentioned, we are going to be discussing some retention periods and life cycles of data. We're going to go through the TPN retention and destruction policy and procedure. Then we're going to go through some best shredding practices, electronic data, what is destruction when it comes to electronic data, as well as the Q&A session like Michelle mentioned. One of the things, please note, we are going to put our feedback forms on. It's going to be sent through the bit.ly link in the live chat on the right-hand side. Please make sure you go and fill out those feedback forms. Vitally important for us to obviously get your feedback, but very important for you to let us know what type of training sessions you would like for us to do in the future. Remember, POPI compliance is a process. It's from 0 to 100%. It doesn't take a day. It really does take some time to get implemented. And you've got until the 1st of July to get yourself fully POPI compliant. We are putting up a new little piece of information, an article throughout this week as well, dealing with Regulation 4 and Regulation 5 of the POPI Act, specifically detailing how to register your information officers. So please keep a watch for that. Also, please note, remember to subscribe and like the page, as well as clicking the notifications bell, because then you'll be notified of all these new training sessions that we are busy doing, as well as in any new releases that we do on any of the products that we do have on TPN, specifically the TPN POPI-Portal, which is so topical at the moment. Data protection is globally relevant. So when we mention this, remember that when we're dealing with POPI, we're also dealing with pieces of different pieces of legislation from other countries, which could include the GDPR, which is the piece of legislation that regulates European Union citizens. But also just note that all across the world, everybody is implementing certain privacy practices when it comes to documentation, when it comes to data subjects information, and specifically when it comes to personal information of people in that specific country. So it's not just a South African practice that is getting implemented on the 1st of July. It's actually a worldwide practice that has already been implemented in certain territories all across the world. So let's get started. I know nobody likes to get been set out specifically in the POPI Act, and what the POPI Act actually speaks notice is when we're going through these certain sections, that's very important, specifically section 14 of POPI, when it comes to retention and destruction, you'll notice that there aren't actually time periods inputted in POPI itself. There's different pieces of legislation that's actually in interplay with POPI that regulates how long information can be kept. So we're going to go through a couple of those as well. I'm going to show you a specific table that's part and parcel to the TPN POPI policy on retention and destruction. Remember, for all of those that are online today, or those of you going to re-look at this video session, all of these policies and procedures that we do talk about from module 1 right through to module 7 is available on the TPN POPI-Portal under the policies tab on your left-hand side. We will also show you that afterwards, but if you go and have a look at the previous videos that we've done on the TPN POPI-Portal, you'll notice we do go through that policies function quite a lot in the training session. So go and have a look at those. You can download them, you can change them the way you'd like, but we're going to be specifically talking about the TPN POPI policy for retention and destruction. So I'm going to read through this. I'm going to explain a couple of different things for you when we do go through this section. So let's head into section 14.1. Subject to subsections 2 and 3, records of personal information must not be retained any longer than is required or necessary for achieving the purposes for which the information was collected or subsequently processed. That's very important. The first section really sets this up. Information cannot be kept longer than is necessary for achieving the purposes than for what the information was actually requested or required in the initial instance, unless retention of the record is required or authorized by law. Very important, because we've got different pieces of legislation with interplay within POPI. The responsible party reasonably requires the records for lawful purposes related to its functions and activities, which for a lot of the schools, this sort of category will fall under that, because you've got personal information on not just necessarily the parents, but the children as well. And as a result of them staying in the schools for multiple years, it might be necessary to keep the information for longer than what is really required right at the beginning for doing the application procedure specifically, but for perhaps sending out invoices and doing certain other things when it comes to the personal information. So some of this might fall underneath this category. C, retention of the record is required by a contract between the parties thereto. Very interesting provision there as well. So if a contract requires that personal information be kept for longer than is actually necessary for achieving the purposes, it's very possible that you can do so. Remember, as part and parcel to this, with the policy documents, we've actually already inputted certain conditions in, say, for example, an employment code of conduct, whereby the employee agrees to keeping information for a certain time period, or longer than it is necessary for achieving the purposes as a result of those being inputted in the contract itself. So you need to go and have a look at those policies and procedures very well. And D, the data subject or a competent person where the data subject is a child has consented to the retention of the record. Now, this is very important. For the schools looking at the session today, remember that consent is incredibly important when it comes to the processing of personal information of children. There's a different subsection in terms of POPI that deals specifically with this. And remember, you don't need the consent from the child, but you actually need the consent from the guardian or the parent of that child to process the personal information of that child. And specifically when it comes to retention, there has been a reiteration in terms of section 14 when it comes to that consent. So moving over to subsection 2, records of personal information may be retained for periods in excess of those contemplated in subsection 1 for historical, statistical, or research purposes if the responsible party has established appropriate safeguards against the records being used for any other purpose. We're going to be discussing this a little bit when we're talking about de-identification of data when we come to the specific slide with the definition of de-identification, but just keep this in your mind. It's possible that you can keep records for historical, statistical, or research purposes if appropriate safeguards, security safeguards, have been taken into consideration when it comes to the data so that data cannot be used by other third parties as a result of you retaining that personal information for the period. Subsection 3, a responsible party that has used a record of personal information of a data subject to make a decision about the data subject must. Very important. When it comes to the school's facilities, it's very possible that a private school might be processing personal information, specifically credit information, from, say, for example, the parents who have applied to the school for specific purposes like placing the child, but also for public schools for exemption purposes, making a decision about the parent. If they fall into those categories for exemption, it's very possible that this specific subsection is actually going to be applicable when it comes to that form of data. So once again, a responsible party that has used a record of personal information of a data subject to make a decision about the data subject must retain the record for such period as may be required or prescribed by law or a code of conduct. We're going to look at that now. Or if there is no law code of conduct prescribing a retention period, retain the record for a period that will afford the data subject a reasonable opportunity, taking all considerations relating to the use of personal information into account to request access to the record. You'll also notice that part and parcel to the policy documents that we do have on the TPN POPI-Portal is those consent documents that a person can fill out to request information from the operator or from the responsible party to see if the information or what information that responsible party is actually keeping on them. So it's very important that this takes into consideration, and we'll have a look at how long those records must be retained when we have a look at that table that I'm going to bring up very shortly. Subsection 4, a responsible party must destroy or delete a record of personal information or de-identify it as soon as reasonably practicable after the reasonable party is no longer authorized to retain the record in terms of subsection 1 and 2. So let's just stop there. We haven't yet talked about the retention periods or how long you may keep the information, but also importantly to note that at the point of time when that record must be deleted, destroyed, or de-identified, this is specifically what must take place. It must be destroyed, deleted, or de-identified. We'll have a look at those definitions now as well. The destruction or deletion of a record of personal information in terms of subsection 4 must be done in a manner that prevents its reconstruction in an intelligible form. And this is specifically what Michelle talked about regarding the actual shredding of physical documentation, that you cannot reconstruct that personal information by any means. And that's where the actual shredding and the destruction of the physical as well as electronic data comes into play. So let's just have a look at destroy, delete, or de-identify. Interestingly enough, destruction or deletion has not been defined in terms of the Act, but we do have certain definitions that we can fall back on. But de-identify is definitely one that is prescribed in terms of section 14. And the definition in terms of POPI reads, In relation to personal information of a data subject means to delete any information that identifies the data subject, can be used or manipulated by a reasonably foreseeable method to identify the data subject, or can be linked by a reasonable foreseeable method to information that identifies the data subject. When we're talking about de-identification, this is the specific definition, but what it means is that information that can link the specific personal information to an actual person, to the data subject, that information must be deleted or de-identified as a result of the information not being processed any further, or you want that information not to be able to have re-looked at by another third party. This also comes into play with the subsection that we just talked about. For the historical, analytical, and research purposes, that information must be de-identified. So you won't be able to link that data subject to that specific personal information that you are still retaining. Now, having a look at what the policies state when it comes to the retention and destruction of periods, we're going to run through a couple of things, but I think it's very important taking into consideration the TPN POPI-Portal as a whole when it comes to the type of information and how long you can retain that information. The reason for that is once you do go through the different functions of the TPN POPI-Portal, you'll notice that we've got a lot of different functions that deal with different facets of the school, of the business. And what it talks to is governance, processes, and people. So when we're talking about personal information, it could very well be that different personal information is captured in different functions of the business. I mean, more information might be processed, or different information might be processed through the finance function than what it is processed through your governance function when it comes to things like your notices of incorporation. So let's run through this table. I'm going to go through these quite quickly, but like I said, remember, this is part and parcel to the TPN POPI policy on the retention and destruction of records. So we're going to go through both electronic and physical data or personal information. So a notice of incorporation can be kept indefinitely. It could be electronic and physical. A memorandum of incorporation and alterations to amendments. I know a lot of schools have this, but it's basically all your CIPC registration documents, electronic and physical, can be kept indefinitely. The rules, should they be applicable, should you have different rules that are associated with your business, they can also be kept indefinitely. Register of company secretary and auditors, also indefinitely. A notice of shareholders meetings, including any resolutions adopted and reports presented in an AGM, can be kept for 7 years, both electronic and physical format. A record of directors, also for 7 years, and minutes of directors meetings, also 7 years. So you'll notice we're running through different functions of your business. This is specifically your company secretarial records that we're dealing with, or your school secretarial records. Financial records of the company, of the organization, or of the school. Your annual financial statements can be electronic and physical, can be kept for 7 years. The accounting records as required by the Companies Act, electronic and physical, also 7 years. Any financial agreements, also electronic and physical, and for 7 years. Banking details, electronic and physical, also 7 years. And then your SARS submissions and other documents relating to your taxation is electronic and physical, but only for 5 years after that submission has been done to the relevant revenue service. Insurance of the company or of the organization, insurance policies held by the organization, electronic and physical, also 7 years, and then a register of immovable property owned by the organization, also 7 years. Now, when it comes to the employment information, you'll see that these retention periods are also restricted. They're less than when we talked about the financial records and the company secretarial records. And remember, like I said, this is not directly in POPI. It's actually relatable, and other pieces of legislation have been inputted into the POPI Act, specifically relating to the retention and restriction of records. So your list of employees, electronic and physical, 3 years. Personal information on employees, electronic and physical, and this is different. You see this 3 years after termination of the employment agreement. Employment contracts of employment, electronic and physical, 3 years after termination. Pension fund and provident fund, electronic and physical, also 3 years. Salaries of employment, 3 years. Leave records, 3 years. health and safety records of earnings and other prescribed particulars of employees, 4 years, and then health and safety committee and incident reports, 3 years in those instances. Then your company policies and directives, internal policies, procedures, and directives relating to employees and the company for 7 years, and then external policies, procedures, and directives relating to clients and other third parties, also 7 years. Now, agreements or contracts, also different. Standard agreements, 3 years after termination. Contracts concluded with customers, 5 years after termination. NDAs or non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements, 3 years after termination. Office management contracts, also 3 years. And then supplier contracts, also 3 years. Remember, we are going through these quite quickly, but they are in the TPN policy for retention and destructions. Go and have a look at that, and what is specifically applicable to you, you can go and mark in that specific policy. Regulatory processes, licenses, and authorities, if they're applicable, they can be kept indefinitely. External newsletters and circulars in terms of published information should be kept for a year. Internal newsletters and circulars, also a year. And then information on the company published by third parties is 1 year. Customer information. Now, this is the one that relates directly to you. And when we're talking about customer information here, it is specifically the parents that are part of the school. And this is vitally important when you're having a look at this. Look at the terms that we've used over here. Company or customer details, electronic and physical, 5 years after termination of that agreement. So 5 years after that agreement has come to its end. Contact details of individuals within customers, 5 years after termination. And then communications with customers, 3 years after termination as well. Now, moving forward into this, we've had a look at how long you can keep the records. Very important, because if you don't know that, you don't know how long those records can actually be kept in your filing cabinets, and how long specifically those records can be kept on electronic data storage methods. Regardless, when it comes to the destruction of paper records, it is incredibly important, just like what Michelle mentioned. Paper is something that can be left around. I see this all across the board. Prior to my work at TPN, I was actually an attorney, and sometimes you'd wonder, attorneys' firms sometimes look like, or you think it would look like something in Suits, where all the files are just kept in a cupboard and everything looks fantastic and everything looks wonderful and it doesn't look like anything's lying around. Trust me, it's not that way. There's a lot of paper records that attorneys do keep. I'm sure there's a lot of paper records that schools do keep as well. Remember, at the end of the day, the destruction of these paper records is so incredibly important. Doing it properly and following proper methods is incredibly important when it comes to the destruction of this. So where a formal decision has been made to destroy company records, the destruction must be done securely. Paper records must either be shredded by the company or placed in confidential bins to be removed by a reputable third-party provider. Paper records must not be discarded in trash cans or destroyed by other unsecured methods, like putting them in file 13 underneath your desk. Let's have a look at how the TPN team, specifically our IT team, destroys the paper records at TPN.
Hi there, you're here to destroy the documents.
Yes, I'm here to destroy the documents.
Please follow me.
Thank you.
It's a heavy one. Let's just check it's all empty.
Yes, empty.
Great. Just make sure the cupboard's locked. That's good.
Right here, Thank
Yes, sir. This is at the bottom here.
Top, your name, down signature.
Loading up and shredding the paper through the our supplier that takes away the paper, and obviously very important. It's not just a case of taking it off site to be shredded. It's actually a case of watching it being shredded in the truck whilst on site to ensure that destruction has been completed?
Michelle, one of the things that comes in mind specifically from that video is where sort of the buck stops when it comes to your procedure. And at the end of the day, remember the buck stops with you. So even if you do provide the information or the paper to a third party to shred, the buck still stops with you. It's still your responsibility as a business, as an organization, to make sure that the best shredding practice has actually been undertaken, and specifically how that those documents are actually shredded. So very, very interesting when it comes to our policy and procedure. And I'm sure a lot of the schools already implement this, but please make sure you are following correct procedure when it comes to your actual policy and procedure. So what you'll notice from that video is that a third-party service provider actually collected our information, but they were placed in confidential tamper-proof bins. So it's not just in the bin next to somebody's desk and that paper gets processed through a shredding company. It's actually in a tamper-proof bin that nobody can go and access after that paper has actually slipped through into that bin. The interim TPN employee then accompanies the service provider to the local shredder. All documents and files shredded in accordance to strict protocols, and then actually Justin signed off on the documents that were shredded by the third-party service provider. So interesting stuff when it comes to actually our procedure and how we do it at TPN when it comes to the shredding. I'm sure they're going to have a lot of questions on the destruction of data and our electronic methods of destruction as well, which we are going to have a look at next. So destruction of electronic records, and we're going to have a look at the video that our IT team also did for this specific section. But before we do that, just remember that there are multiple methods of actually destroying electronic records. There's two methods that we have incorporated in terms of the TPN policy for retention and destruction. The one is called overwriting, and the other one obviously physically destroying the storage media. And overwriting is an effective method, obviously, of deleting certain information on a physical hard drive or on a computer. And it involves basically a program or a software programming rewriting that data, that personal information, the data stored on the electronic media up to 10 times, so that you cannot really identify, you cannot access that information again after that has been done through that medium. The physically destroying storage media is probably the best way to go, because physically destroying the actual data storage device will render it incomplete. You will not be able to access that information again after this is done. So let's have a look how the TPN IT team destroys the data at TPN when it comes to our electronic records.
Hi, I'm Bruce from TPN IT. I need to decommission this computer. Now, will formatting the hard drive erase the data? No, it won't. Will physical damage to the hard drive erase the data? No, it won't. Physical damage to the hard drive might not remove the data. The spindles might be in perfect condition. For peace of mind, the best way to destroy your data is to damage the spindle. That is our data destruction policy at TPN.
Bruce and Justin want a spot in the limelight here, and our jobs here may be at risk.
Michelle, they're more than welcome to come and take over. No, Bruce and Justin definitely did a fantastic job over there explaining exactly how TPN goes and destroys our paper and electronic records. Michelle, that actually brings us to the end of our formal training session for today. Remember, folks, we are running these sessions every second week. We're currently on module 3 of 7. We are going through module 4, 5, 6, and 7 over the next coming weeks before POPI actually gets implemented. So remember to subscribe to the channel and click the notifications bell so that you get updated on that. But Michelle, we can head into the Q&A if there are any questions and answers for this session.
Thanks, Peter. So Everett LaRue has said, drill a hole through the hard drive. Everett, you're absolutely right. I have seen that done. I have seen our IT director physically drilling holes through. There were a couple of suggestions from our IT team today as to, when we did that video, as to how we were going to show the destruction of IT hardware. That was one of the suggestions. There were a few more, but we felt that we were just going to take some of the safe routes. Then we've also had a comment saying, also by Everett, saying that, good morning, getting third party to destroy info is great, but realistically, schools don't have the money for this. And I guess this is one of the areas where you would look to saying, well, if we're not going to have a third party destroying the data, maybe there are other ways on the school site that data can be destroyed as well. Some of the ways that you could do it is having your own on-site shredder and shredding the documents yourself on-site. Peter?
That's 100% correct, Michelle. I remember actually last time we did the session, somebody said that they paint their documents in blue, that they actually go through all their personal documents and specifically from a property company in blue paint. So I think there are some very practical methods that you can actually go and destroy the physical data or paper records of your school without using a third-party service provider.
Peter, Stanford Lake College has actually posted a comment back to Everett to say a company called Erase Data are currently offering a free service to schools in Gauteng, she believes, or they believe. Check them out. So do folks, we're not promoting anyone, we don't know anything about Erase Data, but certainly Stanford College is suggesting that there are other third-party service providers that are offering that to the schools. And Lisa Null is responding to say, I've had to go back through historical minutes of meetings from more than 7 years ago. Could we keep minutes for longer if we can justify this? Peter, and I guess this is the point about what POPI says, that it's whichever piece of legislation provides the best protection to the consumer, we must follow that piece of legislation.
100% correct, Michelle. And I think an important thing to note on some data like that, minutes of meetings or something that the client just mentioned, if the information is de-identified, so if you can't establish that there's a data subject and that information relates to a data subject, it wouldn't necessarily be considered personal information and it wouldn't be regulated by POPI per se. So it would be possible to do that. I think just going through records like that and making sure that the information that you are storing does not contain personal information, and if it does, that information is de-identified, that's a good way of going about it. So actually doing a yearly process of seeing how long these records have been kept and making sure that the records that are being kept longer don't contain personal information, or that information has been de-identified, is a great way to go about it.
And importantly, Peter, I imagine, and importantly, the safeguarding of that information is critical. So again, if data is being held longer, then because you are entitled to in certain instances and circumstances, if the data is being retained for longer, how secure is it?
That's correct, Michelle, 100% right. And I think an important sort of stopping point of that conversation is, remember, this is only one part of POPI, is the retention and destruction of records. Security safeguards and everything that you've got in place, whether it be for physical or electronic access control, has been captured in terms of the TPN POPI-Portal as well. So it's something that you need to go and have a look at. But everything sort of filters together when you're dealing with retention and destruction, or the actual processing of personal information, and specifically in the information that you're keeping there on. The security safeguards is definitely one of those things that organizations, schools need to go and have a look at as well. Yeah.
Peter, I'm just going to remind our viewers that we do have a feedback form. Our team is posting that feedback form onto the chat live for you at the moment. Please do fill in the feedback form. Tell us how you felt the session went. Give us some comments about other subjects that you feel would be important for us to address as well. It is useful for us. And we're going to keep those feedback forms available for you to complete for the next 30 minutes as the session draws to an end, and just after the session, so that you can come in and provide us that important feedback. Also, we have a school survey that is currently live. We're going to have that survey open until the 15th at 5 o'clock on the 15th. That survey, we do ask our schools to provide us some information as to how their school has operated through the COVID pandemic period, and to provide us with some insights so that we can help address some of the challenges that the schools have had. We do want to relate it back to the survey that we did prior to the pandemic, where we got feedback as to some of the top challenges that the schools were facing, and to have a comparison to what we're seeing post that pandemic. Peter?
Correct, Michelle. Most certainly very important. I mean, that survey does give a lot of information, not just to us, but for the schools joining us and who are our customers. So it would be very valuable, not from our side, but also from yours, to please complete that survey for us today.
Fantastic. I see Brian from our team has loaded both the feedback form and the survey. So we do appreciate, for those that are online at the moment, if they wouldn't mind taking an extra 5 minutes just to complete both of those for us. We've got a question here, Peter, from Estelle, who's asking, where should a school start to ensure POPIA compliance? What should be our first steps? Thank you, Estelle.
Great question. Estelle, I think at this point in time, because you are getting a lot closer to the actual date that you need to be implementing and be fully compliant in terms of this act, it's very important to start doing a personal information impact assessment. It's one of those things that have been regulated in terms of the guidelines as well as the regulations to POPI, that already needs to be started by your information officer at your organization. So I would suggest doing your personal impact assessment. It's a gap analysis on where the school is keeping information, what type of information they are keeping, and also the control measures in place and certain policies and procedures that you need to implement. That is part and parcel to the TPN POPI-Portal. You can perform the personal information impact assessment directly there through. We are actually putting out, like I mentioned, another article this week regarding the registration of your information officer and how to go about that. It's an email system at the moment, so you need to email a specific annexure, well, 2 annexures directly through to the information regulator to get that started. But the personal information impact assessment is going to give you quite a good overview on where you are currently with POPI compliance and what you still need to do as an organization to be fully POPI compliant.
So Peter, I remember TPN's a registered credit bureau. And in terms of our submission for our NCR audit, which happens on an annual basis, we've also been going through the process of doing our personal information impact assessment with our compliance auditor. So we've been doing this for a number of years leading up to the requirements in terms of POPI. This year, as it turns out, we are now effective. So this requires that every business, every school does have a personal information impact assessment that must be performed by the 1st of July, the 30th of April. In fact, earlier, Peter, is it not the 1st of May in terms of regulation 4 and 5?
That's correct, Michelle. In terms of full compliance, obviously the date is 1st of July, but one of the responsibilities of the information officer at an organization is to perform a personal information impact assessment. And those dates are correct. You're 100% correct with that date on being 1st of May. So I think that is going to be your first protocol, your first start in getting yourself POPI compliant, is performing that personal information impact assessment. It's going to be vital because it really doesn't just show you where your risks lie, but it also shows you how to mitigate and manage that risk when you're dealing with personal information of both children and parents at the school.
So historically, when TPN was doing our personal information impact assessment with our compliance auditors, Bates and RP, Abel was taking us through his version, which was an Excel document. And when POPI was made effective, I said to Abel, let's make this into a system and let's get this into the hands of our clients as quickly as possible and as affordably as possible. So the TPN POPI-Portal, which you can access at popia.tpn.co.za, this is an 800 Rand system. That is per annum, 800 Rand per annum, and it allows you to take every single function in your business, and there are 9 of them, Peter, if I'm not correct? 9 different functions and 130 different sub-processes, and work your way through each sub-process to identify the inherent risk in your business, the residual risk as a result of the controls that you in your business currently have in place, and it works you through the 8 different conditions of lawful processing. All of this is available on our playlist. So if you haven't yet watched module 1 and 2, please log into the playlist on YouTube, watch module 1 and 2, and now module 3 will be taking you through the 7 different modules and effectively going through that portal with you so that we get you ready by that deadline.
One just note from my side, also please note that the TPN POPI-Portal is not just the personal information impact assessment. You can obviously also assign different tasks to staff members to start performing the different sub-functions and perhaps the gaps that you've missed at the organization, but it also includes the TPN policies and procedures. The one that we just went through today is actually part and parcel to the TPN POPI-Portal as well. So for the 800 Rand XVAT, it's not just the personal information impact assessment, it's also your policies and procedures.
And your action plan, as you rightly said. Thanks, Peter. Thank you for that.
Pleasure, Michelle.
Folks, I think that's it. I'm not seeing any more questions coming up online, and I'd like to greet all of our delegates today and say thank you very much for joining with us and for the wonderful questions. Peter, thanks for joining us from Pretoria.
And your pleasure, Michelle. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone.